So everyone, the Ship of Theseus Paradox. The idea that if eventually over time, every single plank and every single part of a ship is replaced, to where eventually there is no single part that remains the same from the original ship that belonged to Theseus. Is it the same ship? Is it, even if it is identified as being owned by Theseus, is it fundamentally the same ship? Now, there are so many paradoxes that are paradoxes because we're thinking too small. We're thinking that everything in the universe is separate. That is, it is fundamentally separate, and that we divide it into categories because we can only understand the universe by dividing it into categories, by dividing it into parts, segmenting it off. This is a rock, this is a forest, this is a tree, this is a human being, this is an animal. We understand our universe by segmenting it. But when we try to apply that to logic, when we use the segmented universe that we have created in our brains and apply it to logical theorem, it simply produces paradoxes a lot of the time. It produces quandaries, it produces things that don't make any sense because the way we're perceiving the universe doesn't make any sense. Now, if everything on this ship is replaced with something else, and would it still be the Ship of Theseus, the original Ship of Theseus, the original one that was crowned and given the name and given the ownership of, but that the ownership part is a little bit less than the rest of the problem, the rest of the paradox. We have to understand that our segmentation can't be applied to the ultimate forms of logic. Everything in the universe is constantly exchanging atoms, exchanging energy, exchanging just fundamental components of itself, to the extent that nothing is really separate. Nothing is in and of itself completely isolated. Nothing can be said to be completely in and of itself separate from everything else. Now, this hurts our human ego, and it hurts our idea of segmentation, of categorization, of separation. And the reason why it hurts our ego and our logic is that the way we understand our universe is that we understand it by looking at specific little bits and trying to understand those little bits. But we as human beings don't, a lot of the time, realize that understanding those little bits doesn't mean that understanding applies to the rest of the universe. It just applies to if we're isolating a tiny bit of the universe, and then understanding that, and even if we understand that fully, and that process is necessary to understand a small part of the universe, whether it be a rock or a sun or something much bigger like a galaxy, we can't apply how we understand a single piece of the universe to the rest of the universe, as if these two things are separate. The problem is with the paradox of Theseus's ship is that we don't see that just because something is replaced completely, that doesn't mean that our naming of it is false, our understanding of it is false, our identification of it is false, because ultimately the system of separation, that is what is truly false in the ultimate sense. Now, this idea of separating different things is necessary for us to exist. I am separate from somebody else in idea, and that's how we make laws and classify each other in society and say where each other is at any given point or any given time. But as far as these grand logical paradoxes, we can't apply the same segmented logic, the same segmented understanding to grander understanding, because it doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, everything is always exchanging with everything else. Time is an illusion, and the ultimate truth of the universe is that everything is connected, and that space itself is an illusion, and that the end result of the universe is that everything is one, and it's constantly pushing and pulling against each other. But that doesn't mean that these things that are pushing and pulling are separate from each other. It just means that they're in the same thing, they're part of the same thing. It's just all about movement relative to time, and time itself is completely understood by us in accordance with relativity between objects. That's the only way time exists. Now, that's why the theory of relativity is called the theory of relativity, because it's all about the relationship. It's not about what things were before a universe came into being that even seemed separate from one thing to another. Before the Big Bang, when everything was just very compressed, the same exchanges were happening. You know, looking at it from a philosophical and spiritual point of view, the same exchanges were happening just on a smaller scale, and everything that will ever happen was basically decided on those tiny exchanges in that tiny little amount of space before the Big Bang. Everything that would ever happen already happened in that tiny piece of space, because the exchanges that happened there are the exchanges we're experiencing much later. And, you know, we wouldn't consider something very small that produced the Big Bang to have the same amount of relationship and division as far as this being that, because it's so small. But our idea of scale is off. And ultimately, everything is the same size. It's just different in proportion because of time, which ultimately is a human concept, just like death is a human concept. Really, the only thing that exists is that which has always existed, and that's another conversation that can be had. But I hope my ranting on this subject has been interesting, and I hope that, you know, I gave you a couple ideas, hopefully, maybe. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope you watch my videos in the future.